and Alfred, amused by Steepa's suggestion, who Edward had made a conduit for the idea, had agreed, and Osrith's day was only going to get worse as the king, the royal family and assembled lords congregated in the training quad to watch Edward practice. This was not how it should go, Osrith thought, dully. A fight was something you acted to, you built towards, making snap decisions based on experience and guile. Edward was grinning like it was a treat, like he has organized a summer's picnic by the Itchen for them all. Edward had left his bedchamber at first light, and Osrith, hungry, had turned up at the kitchen to see what was on offer. Small groups of guards were nudging one another, Osrith noticed, as she crossed the flagstones and spoke to one of the maids, and it took for Elfrith to pull her to one side when she had in her hands new baked bread and a stone of milk to ask her whether it was true. "Is what true?" Osrith asked, genuinely surprised. "That you are going to fight the Etheling?" His voice was low, and Osrith knew whatever she said, her gossipy friend would be gleeful at the news. "He wants me to fight with him, that's all, so he can be tested. He said he would ask Steepa." Osrith shrugged, and bit into the bread, its warmth filling her mouth satisfyingly. "Well, of course, he went to the king for his agreement." Osrith stared at Elfrith, glanced behind him at a grinning Elfgar and at the young warriors, Godwin and Hayard amongst them, and back to his eager face. "The king has agreed?" she asked, amazed. The Etheling was just a boy, he was learning to be a warrior. But Osrith was no teacher, she could demonstrate what she knew, of course, if Steepa asked her. But to oppose the Etheling? Not waiting for a reply, Osrith thrust her breakfast into Elfrith's hands and tore off to the guardhouse. She found Steepa, head bent over a mail coat, inspecting the rings. "Steepa!" Osrith exclaimed. "Please! Tell me I am not to oppose the Etheling." Due to his size, it took a long time for the head of the Wessex household guard to raise his head to Osrith's gaze, and her desperation to see that he agreed made it seem even slower. Steepa's mouth was in a half-grin, and he nodded to Osrith. "He is a little too slightly built to wear this, I am in the process of removing some of the length, so it will not be too heavy for him." Osrith's heart sank. Here, in Wessex? She had fought with Constantine, of course, but she had been smaller herself, then, and he had grown much stronger than her. What if she were to injure him, Edward, the king's eldest son, with such plans for his future, a Danish half-kingdom to win back for all Saxons? Kingdoms to unite? No. Steepa held her gaze and Osrith broke off. "I have informed the king of the Etheling's proposal, and I have advised that he may be in a good deal of danger from a warrior as formidable as yourself." Steepa stepped back from the mail, inspecting its alteration. "You are to begin today, and continue the day after tomorrow, for there will be no sword practice on the day of his daughter's wedding." Steepa sounded as if he had memorized Alfred's words, and Osrith found herself nodding, silently as he continued. "You must not go easy on the boy," he added. "This is an instruction from the king himself." "I must not go easy on the boy," Osrith thought to herself, as the boy in question stood before her, the otherwise pleasant mid-morning summer sun illuminating the battleground which was the courtyard of the palace, so everyone might see them. "I must not go easy on the boy, and were I to try to back out of it, Alfred may conclude that, as I do not want the boy to progress, that I am disloyal to Wessex, that Irian, or Alba, or wherever I come from, has planted me to shelter the boy, so the boy may not learn when he takes the throne." How fanciful that sounded, Osrith thought grimly. But it was Elfrith who put that idea into her mind, and she had stood before King Alfred twice since she arrived in Wessex, and that was twice too often, before his steely, uncompromising glare, expressionless face and domineering intellect. So now she was drawing buée as the mail-clad boy stood before her, as spry and agile as she remembered Constantine to be. And she would not go easy, for Alfred would know, otherwise. Those gathered to see this spectacle faded beyond her sight, the king with his lords, Osrith noticed, including Oda, who smiled at her, encouragingly. Beside him sat Ethelfled, who was scowling, and scowled more when she caught Osrith's eye. Beaming to her right were the Mercen Guard, Lord Ethliard seated to their opposite side and Miral's brother-in-law, Ethliard's advisor Aldhelm, watching on in interest. Others, too, were gathering, but Osrith knew that if she saw her brother, she would stand aside. This was too much. In no battle ever did spectators crowd around two opponents to watch the battle. This was not a Norse or Danish square. This was not Tara, and she was not fighting Domhnall's man, Bryn, for possession of the sword she was now holding. Osrith squashed them all beyond sight and imagined she was on a battlefield, carnage being wreaked where these people looked on. Her enemy was before her, and her job was to disarm this boy in any way that she could before dispatching him to God. Bue's polished steel dazzled. "Thou shalt not kill," the Bible told her, Father Becker told her, and yet there seemed to be, for Christians, the caveat of, unless it is for possession of land or wealth for your king. And she would not kill, not today. Yet, she could not oppose Edward, truly, unless she fought with her heart. It began before Osrith realized she had begun to scream. Not rushing in was Edward's first mistake. He was casing her out, judging her moves, and he was startled at her ferocious cry. Before he had even begun to oppose Osrith, he should have had some idea of the way the enemy would come at him, and he dodged her first thrust, more out of chance than any tactic. Stipe must have coached him, surely, Osrith thought, and she turned quickly to see him running at her, sword aloft. Good. He knew how to use ironware, and Osrith parried the blade away from her, ducking below his arm. Turning, she faced the boy again, her mind remembering when, instead of fighting against Constantine as a tutor, she would fight alongside him, and learn. She had learned from the best experience that she could. Domhnall had taken the field alongside her, and Osrith, clad in Constantine's armor, had fought the Norse unto Ivarloithbroek was in front of him, and he had slain him. It had been enough to get rid of the Norse, who had slowly drifted to kin in Ireland, where she had faced them again, and again at Caeligwylid. Danes were not much different. And in order to be an excellent, wise, decision-maker, Edward would have to face them too. Alfred would have to put his son out into the field in order for him to learn. And he had the capacity to. Even now, stroke after stroke, making little impact on Osrith, he was anticipating her move, making imperceptibly tiny adjustments to pace and severity, and more were meeting her shield with force. Osrith dodged as a blade came between her arm and her head. She didn't hear the audible gasp as those watching saw her twist around, catching Edward round the thigh, and bringing him to ground. The thump was sickening, but the Etheling was on his feet before she had turned and managed to thrust his sword towards her. Clearly, as Stipe had been explicit with her role in this fight, he had been clear with Edward, give no quarter, and he gave none, as the blade sliced down her forearm, wrenching apart the leather of her jerkin and leaving a trail of blood down one side. It was nothing. Osrith fought on, bringing Bue's pommel down at the back of his neck, and Edward slumped down. Her heart was thumping so loudly, it almost felt as if it were coming out of her chest as she forced herself to step away from her opponent, fighting with every sinew her instinct to turn her sword up the other way and deliver the killing blow. Silence deafened the courtyard as no one moved. Edward was still slumped on the ground, and Osrith watched for signs of, well, signs of life. Had she injured him? She had tried to be as good an opponent as possible while on the other hand, not actually doing any harm. She looked around for a cue, anything. But nothing came, not from Stipe, not from her guards, nor, curiously, from the king. So Osrith stepped towards the Etheling, and stooped towards him. She whispered, "And now it is time to go for me, your opponent who had stopped to discover your condition, and shown her weakness." She ducked her head further. "Go for me, now." Osrith didn't have to ask twice. From closed eyes on the dry ground to up onto his feet a moment later, the Etheling sprung, sweeping a leg around Osrith's which had her over. Very good, she thought, and told herself that she must remember that one. Osrith knew she should roll away, but remained. Later, many years later, Osrith would remember that fight, and how, potentially, she could have lost on all fronts. Maybe, aged 15, she had learned a lesson all women learned, sooner or later, that you had to give all to everyone, and keep them all happy regardless, with your own needs last. That was why she knew she was a woman. Had she behaved like a man, had she defeated Edward to show she was stronger and more adept at battle work, then she would have pleased King Alfred but put Lady Elswith against her. Had she, a female, lost easily to ensure Edward was victorious and therefore throne-worthy, then her reputation as a warrior would have been brought into question and she might easily have been pushed aside. Men who failed, they were given a second chance, their failure chalked up to bad luck. Women who failed, well, it was inevitable, wasn't it? Never give a woman a second chance and, come to think of it, it was questionable why said woman had been given a chance in the first place. So Osric had chosen intelligence, and had chosen a hard fight and a dirty ending. It was about Edward, after all. It was he who was going to have to face Danes on a battlefield and instruct men to fight for him. Danes did not respect Christian conventions. Anything which desecrated the body after death, such as decapitation or dismemberment, were favored especially because they horrified Christians. Edward Atheling would have to learn to deal with all of that, and deal with filthy tricks and give no quarter. Edward swung his sword. It was an armory one that Osric recognized, for she had polished many. It quavered in the air as it reflected the sun's high rays and the Atheling brought it around in one arc, slicing through the air. And struck, plunging the metal towards her body. No coward, Osric thought. Don't be a coward. Don't close your eyes, act as if you are incapacitated and death were hastening to your side. Watch, and don't move. See what he will do. The sword struck with skilled accuracy. Osric made a mental note to herself that she must congratulate Edward on this. It plunged into the earth just by her right ear, deep enough that it could hold itself up. Osric waited. And then, there it was, the applause. Edward was beaming from his happy face as the crowd congratulated him, his sister uncharacteristically pulling herself to him, keen, no doubt, to be in his reflected glory. Or, maybe the next day, when she was wed, was dawning that she wasn't going to be calling Winchester her home for much longer. A hand was thrust her way. Steeper helped her up and Osric brushed herself down, glad that little notice was being taken of her as the lords crowded around Edward, his father and mother first with a firm, praising word and hands clapping his shoulders. Well done, was all Steeper had to say, which was enough for Osric. She got to her feet. She had done what he had asked, done what the king had wanted. Her eye trailed after her charge. Osric hoped the attention he was getting was enough to raise his courage. She made her way towards the armory after that, taking the palace's sword, which Edward had used, with her. She had no further instructions other than to take on palace duties, which meant Edward was with his family. His sister was marrying the next day, so presumably there were arrangements to make and fulfill on her last day as Alfred's daughter, before she became Ethelred's wife. As she got to the gate which led towards the kitchens and stables, as Alfred beckoned her over, Osric saw her brother and his men stalking across the stones towards the south gate. They had been there, she realized. They had seen her fight. Well, no matter. But Osric felt then very glad that she hadn't known. Someone else who had been watching her was watching her now, crossing the cobbles towards the armory towards one of her comrades. You will keep, thought the man, felt cheated of the Wessex throne, as his trousers tightened around his erection. And, if it's a fight you want, it's a fight you can have. 88,888,888. Osric was in no mood to be around the palace that evening, as a celebratory feast was held in Ethelflaed's honor. Once she had polished every sword under Steeper's responsible hand, she proceeded to the shields, spears, axes and anything else therein. As the evening drew on and the sun eventually dropped behind the horizon, Osric crossed to the kitchens for a jug of milk before going over to the stables to begin again the task that the stable hands had already completed. Elfrith and Elfda were already guarding in the palace's hall and she was glad of that. Glad she didn't have to sit through the rhetoric and praise, wishing she was back in Alba where speeches lasted just over 2 minutes, if they were very long, and drinking was the order of the night. Everything seemed better there, and if she knew she could buy her freedom from Domhnall, which could save her from the promises he had given in her name as her lord, then she would, Osric thought. Silver enough, and to do that, no attachment, just to work and earn it. for Wessex was not her home, and, the more she watched her brother, the more it was obvious it was not his, either. Land and wealth were his priority, to be close to Booker and his adopted sister, and give his family, his second family, for his first had been with Mildred, security and safety. But eventually, if Osric didn't rob it all from him, Uhtred would have enough money to launch an attack on Wibbenburg and go home. Hadn't she decided the same? She had come to Wessex to earn money through fighting. A hand on her shoulder made Osric jump as she swept a small pile of dung-filled straw towards the entrance of the courtyard, and, just for a moment, she thought it was Domhnall Ui Neil. Instead, Elfrith, merry-faced and mirthful, was proffering ale and bread. "You have not been to the hall." It was a statement, rather than a question. "Alfred has bidden all servants, all warriors, everyone to sup this night. I would rather drink the piss of these horses and eat their excrement than honor that daughter of his, who would trick her brother cruelly and think nothing of bullying weaker servants who have no power or influence. I have too sore memories of times such as this," she said, vaguely. "It is too much to bear, so I chose to be useful, instead." "Is there anywhere in the palace you haven't cleaned?" Elfrith asked, as Osric took the bread. "If there is, tell me, for when I go to my guard duty for the Atheling, I do not want my memories to come to me." Elfrith sat down in the straw. "My wife made these," he said, as he bit into his own bread. Osric, on her way to sit next to him, stopped, and looked down at her friend's face. He wasn't joking. "Your wife?" He stopped in his act of sipping from his ale flagon and nodded over its rim. "While you fight to earn silver, and, don't worry, the silver you stole and hid over there," he pointed to the beam of the stables at whose base Osric had dug her hole to put her brother's wealth. Osric made to get up, to find it, but Elfrith pulled her back down. "Don't worry. It is still there, I dug it a little deeper for you. Whatever your secrets are, keep them." He sighed deeply, and looked at the floor. "For my part, my debt is being paid in Lord Odda's service. I drank." He glanced down at the flagon, then pushed it to one side of him, letting it go, "Not this watered-down palace stuff, but proper ale, like at the Two Cranes, and I gambled. So, to pay back what I owed, I gave the only thing I had, my time. The Lord Odda was kind enough to let me do so in his service. Otherwise." "Otherwise?" Osric prompted, dropping down next to her, suspecting she knew the answer. "Otherwise," Elfrith repeated, then drew a line with his index finger across his throat. "I owed a great deal, and Alfred's law requires no debtors, or that the person owed the debt is to choose the method of repayment. Ethelwold was about to choose before Odda intervened." "Ethelwold? The king's nephew? And he was about to choose death?" "He wanted me to repudiate my wife." There was that word again, Osric noticed. It was Elfrith who had used it to describe Uhtred's actions towards his first wife, Odda's goddaughter. "And she works in the kitchens?" Osric prompted, feeling aggrieved at the injustice of making a man give up his wife. How could the law, the Christian law, allow it? God, she missed Alba sometimes, and the stricter application of the gospel through the Irish church. Osric bit into her bread again. And that was the second time she had heard of the king's nephew tricking someone. He was angry he didn't have a throne, and took it out on other people. He spent a good deal of his time with her brother, too, Osric had noticed. "She makes good bread," Osric said, when the conversation had dropped to nothing. "It is no wonder you married her." Elfrith turned sharply to Osric. "I would have died for her, I would have done anything. I was trying to buy her out of service. Do you see?" Suddenly, Elfrith's demeanor of pleasantly, teasingly, gossiping guard who was first with rumor and scandal on his lips was swept aside, and in flashed an Elfrith Osric had never seen before, angrily grave. He turned away, and Osric placed a hand on his shoulder. "How long until you are free of your time in service to Odda?" she asked, kindly. 17 days, he replied. "Then the 5 years will be up." 5 years, thought Osric in her own mind. What a time to be made to give up your life for the sake of debt. "And what will you do?" Jarl and I will go to Mercia, he replied. We have no desire to remain in Wessex. I am a good guard, and Mirral has already said there will be a place for me in the Merson household guard. And you would leave your home? Elfrith narrowed his eyes as if she were moon-touched. In a heartbeat. This land has done me no good. I was Elfrith of Wessex, I will soon be Elfrith of Mercia. After a heartbeat, his eyes narrowed in the dusk light. And whence does Osrith hail? Nowhere that I know, she replied. I have spent many years in Alba and Irin. But I am from neither of those places. North, somewhere, although I do not know where. I am Lackland. Osrith Lackland, who fought so cunningly this day, Elfrith remarked, pushing a jar of milk towards her. Jarl milked the goat herself, he added. Cunning? Why so? Because you gave the Atheling the fight he needed and you made sure it looked like he won. Looked like? Osrith scoffed. I tried to overreach myself and he took advantage and took the killing stroke. If I had been a Dane then I would have been skewered right through. Elfrith narrowed his eyes still further. Both you and I know this is not true, most of the people who watched know this is not true. But, if you will deceive yourself. His voice trailed off to nothing, and he gripped his flagon. If it had been a throat, its owner would now have been choking to death. And you lost to Ethelwold, she murmured, as Elfrith watched the sky fill with stars from the door of the stable. I was stupid enough to lose to the most dangerous man in Wessex, Elfrith murmured, then belched. Most dangerous? He fears nothing. Elfrith bit back. He wants nothing more than the throne of Wessex. Beyond that, he has no immediate family, no one he truly cares for, no one who truly cares for him. The most dangerous men in the world are those who have nothing to lose. And because they have nothing to lose, they have nothing to fear. And men become little more than playthings to them. He leaned towards her for a moment. Those who lack a land to love are a little like that, too. They said nothing more, simply sat beyond the horses as they stamped and sniffed in their equestrian slumber, as torches were lit and put out, as guards changed and people went between the hall and the kitchens. At length, Elfrith left Osrith, who then returned to the Etheling's room. She was pleased to see that Edward was asleep, and relieved one of Steeper's men, who had been assigned guard duty to the boy. But Edward was not asleep, and when she closed the door behind her and made to settle under her blanket behind the door, Edward called her over to him. It's going to be such a brilliant day tomorrow, he enthused, pleased with the grandness of the wedding and its arrangements, no doubt. There will be Father Bicker, there will be a speech, and my sister in her gown and the Mersons all stood around in their finery. When Osrith said nothing, he drew back his covers and sat on his bed, head in his hands. Osrith sat down beside him and he turned his face to her. Is it because I beat you this morning? Is what because you beat me this morning? Osrith repeated, at a loss. Why you were not at the feast this evening? I was cleaning the armory, and then the horses, Osrith reiterated. It's what happens when you lose to the Atheling and show up your commanding officer. Technically, Mirral, not Steeper, was her commander, and neither of them had made her clean anything. She turned a smiling face to the boy. You fought well, very well Edward, she added, and he beamed. But, you will need to do a lot more practice. You will one day be strong enough to beat me with force alone, but that day needs to be soon. Your father is about to lose one of his children tomorrow, and he does not want you to be defeated by me in the next few months. You also need to use guile. I wouldn't have beaten you if you had let me, he said, his happy mood fading. Today, you beat me. That was what the people watching saw. But your father would have known. I am a woman, as you know. You need to be good enough to defeat a woman, soon. Osrith put her hand out onto his arm, consolingly. One day you will learn more than I can ever teach you and will be able to beat me with ease. But you must practice, much more than you do, and learn all you can. You will never know how the Norse fight, how the Danes fight, unless you practice and perfect every single part of your repertoire. And even then, you will not know what they are like until you face them. Is that what you did? Edward's face was open and receptive, wanting a story, needing to hear something to calm his mind. But instead, against her better instincts, Osric told him about the moment she had put on Constantine's armor and fought beside her lord. "I took what armor I could. I fought even before I had been shown how." "You must have had great courage." Osric looked at him. A boy, well cared for, a royal prince, in a land so highly sought the Danes would never give up. It gave almost guaranteed harvests year by year, even in poor years where, otherwise, a kingdom would starve to the point of being a word in a monastic chronicle, whose fate some future reader would ponder over, wondering where Hicks or Elmet really was. Wessex was rich, which was why the Saxons had displaced the Britons in the centuries before. Edward could not possibly conceive of the threat they posed. His father was on the battlefield beside 4 brothers at about his age, out of necessity. "I did what I had to survive, and I hope I served my lord well," was all that Osric would say, despite the Atheling urging for more, and as she tried to settle to rest beside his door, he kept hissing questions at her across his bedchamber. "You would do well to remember you fight a woman, and you must overcome me to prove that you are king-worthy." "But practice," Osric snapped back, and in the end went to sit silently at the end of his bed until dawn, pushing him firmly back onto his feather mattress each time he tried to sit up and talk to her until he went to sleep. It would be no good him being tired all the way through to the wedding, Osric thought, and she herself would welcome exhaustion, for it would take her mind of the proceedings, until the time she could guard the Atheling again come dusk. 88,888,888. Though she was smiling, Osric thought she had never seen a person look as discontent as Ethelfled as she was on her wedding day. Not that she had much experience. But Malmuir had looked positively radiant with joy whilst marrying Flancina at Tara, as radiant as Osric remembered her to be when she had called her into her rooms to ask her to collect urchins for their ink for the Ionian Gospels, which were to be completed at Kells. In fact, while she had never seen Malmuir, Sainid MacAlpin's daughter, less than joyfully assertive over whatever situation she was presiding, Osric thought that she had never seen Ethelfled, daughter of King Aled, anything less than self-centeredly sullen. The ceremony, conducted by Father Becker in Winchester Cathedral, who had himself been wed, Elfrith had told her the night before, to the Danish woman who was standing with her brother's warriors, was wearyingly long. Beside Uhtred stood a woman in a red dress, who Osric had seen before. Gisela did not look like Guthred, and she seemed overcome with overwhelming joy. Osric looked a little longer, as the daughter of Harthknut, cousin to Ivar, reached down and took Uhtred's hand. Happiness because of wedding? Remembering her own? Her own had been based around her being brought here from their uncle, Elfgar, for whom Guthred had intended her. Ha, thought Osric. The man could not decide everything with marriage, nor could Guthred. Nor still could Domhnall. Why would anyone choose that when they could fight instead? Many prayers were said for the couple, for their lands in Wessex, for Mercia, that the union should bring forth bounties of children and riches, that their lands should grow together in a political union, and so on, and so forth. Osric, instead, busied herself with reading the tapestry hangings around the chapel's walls, and had got approximately 2/3 of the way through the Old Testament, by her reckoning, before the happy couple, the king and his lady, the nobles and lords, all made their way to the large hall, usually Alfred's throne room, which Osric had organized, along with the rest of the guards, both of Wessex and Mercia. That morning, a tired Osric was aware of, well, to put it bluntly, a not small measure of respect coming her way. Miral, for instance, clapped her on the back and told her that, as he was returning with the Mercian guard, he would keep a place for her should she decide she wished to leave her babysitting duty in Wessex. Steeper countered that she was in the employ of Wessex, and she had no leave to transfer to Mercia. Osric thanked them both for their confidence in her and went to arranging the tables with Elfrith and Elfgar, who was also returning to Aylesbury. Now, the nobles, the lords and guests were seated at the tables and benches they had laid out, and Osric was on guard a little way beyond Alfred's table, and was able to find other directions in which to look so she did not have to see Ethelfled's sour face, which she was busy displaying when she thought no one could see her. "You the boy?" Osrith looked to one of the tables near the center of the hall. A lord was half standing and pointing to his tankard. "Yes, you, boy," he exclaimed, when he saw her looking. "Bring me wine." Osrith nodded, and turned to one of the maids, who was carrying a tray. On it contained a flagon which, on inspection, did indeed contain wine. She stepped towards the lord, who was holding his stone high, and she poured out the last of it, returning to her place, and giving the wooden flagon to another maid, who was heading back out into the passage between the hall and the kitchens. "How long is this going to go on?" Osrith turned as Elfgar smiled at her, disguising his grumble with a sleight of hand as if trying to tell her the passage was clear of any threats there might be to the wedding breakfast. "I know," Osrith said, pointing towards the passage herself. "I'd rather be doing the stables." At which point, Elfgar grinned, and scanned the guests. "I know where there are bigger turds." But his face fell quickly, and Osrith realized there was someone behind her. She turned, and found herself face to face with Ethelwold. "Lord Ethelwold!" Osrith exclaimed, the nobleman's face leering close to her own. "If it is wine you seek, I sent the last empty flagon back to the kitchen," and, she broke off as Ethelwold gripped her jerkin, walking her quickly towards the door to the outer passage, his glare one which made Osrith more than a little concerned. She had only ever encountered Ethelwold drunk. Now, he did not look drunk. He looked furious. "Where are we going, my lord?" she asked loudly, hoping that Elfgar might hear. He frog-marched her down the corridor and slammed her against one of the stone wall. They were out of sight of the doorway, and pressed he held her against it. "You act as if you are innocent," he began. His breath, usually reeling of stale ale, was cool on her neck. "I know you commune with pagans." Osrith said nothing as King's nephew leered at her, only cursed her stupidity. She should have gone back that night that she had gone to buy roots the moment she suspected someone of following her. What was it that Elfrith had said? The most dangerous man in Winchester because he had nothing but his single-minded ambition and had nothing to lose. What did he really want? "Should he know, my uncle would have you hanged as a witch," he continued, and Osrith soon found out. When shuddered at the memory of Bark, she realized he had moved closer to her. However, Ethelwold continued lightly, his demeanor changing like the weather on a spring day in Northumbria. "When I am king," he pushed her up against her body with his own, "it will be of no consequence to me." Osrith was surprised to be able to push Ethelwold easily to one side and step towards the hall's door once more. Her hand imperceptibly hovered over Buie. But the man was fast and he had her pinned against the wall in a heartbeat. "I do not know what you think, my lord," Osrith said, making her voice consciously loud so as to hopefully be heard by someone, at least, in hall as her pulse quickened. She tried to control her breathing, get back into control, so the next move she made was a sensible one. "I am the Etheling's guard, nothing more." "Admit nothing," Osrith told herself sharply. "Admit nothing, ask for understanding for nothing. This man works for his own amusement." Just like the time he sprang into her fight and attacked his own cousin, to see what she would do. As Ethelwold made a grab for her once more, Osrith stepped aside. "I guard his life with my own, nothing more," she repeated, and watched as Ethelwold smiled that reptilian smile of his, but did nothing, as Osrith turned and made to stride back to the feast. Nothing, at first. His swiftness was unnerving, and just as Osrith's thoughts turned to service in the hall, she found he was holding her against the palace wall once more. Looking about, Osrith shuddered as she felt his hand wandering to her chest, trying to feel for her breasts, and that same trapped feeling came over her, which she had first experienced when she had overheard Domhnall discuss his plans for her with Constantine. "Ah, but I could make you queen," he purred, and his handsome face crinkled into what he must have thought was an alluring way. Osrith said and did nothing, for a moment, as his hands began to work their way down her body, then all of a sudden, ducked under his arm, and strode back towards the hall. She was aware of heavy footsteps behind her, and she took her place opposite the lord's table, scanning for wine to bring, food to offer, anything that would give her opportunity to be visible, to be useful. Her heart was beating fast. Osrith knew she could not have attacked Ethelwold in broad daylight. He was royalty after all, and she could get in trouble for it. Yet, Alfred had found out about the silver, and his nephew would undoubtedly go to his uncle and claim she had attacked him. Perhaps even so. He was dangerous, and Osrith would now have to make sure she did nothing to anger him, nothing to provoke him, do nothing that could even be interpreted as a slight towards him. What was that? Elfka hissed to her, nudging his head to the passage, and again to Ethelwold, who sauntered lazily back into the hall. Osrith fixed her eyes on her comrade, so fiercely that Elfka looked away for a moment. Nothing I can't handle. He wasn't drunk for a start, which was a little concerning. You're shaking, Elfka commented. It's a cold day, she replied, in defiance of the evidence of the bright, hot sun streaming through the doors and windows of there. You can go, Miral told Osrith, said to Elfka, who, after a backwards glance at Osrith, raced off to the kitchen, one of the maids having caught his eye. Elfrith had told her. Elfrith himself, standing opposite her, on the other side of the hall, twinkled at one of the serving women, who smiled deeply back. His wife, Ial? Osrith wondered. Beside her, a voice made her start. You too, Osrith. It was Miral, and he was merry again. She was astonished at his change of demeanor, what being in the wrong place for the wrong circumstances could do to the manner of a man. Odo would soon be losing 2 of his guards. But, the kind-hearted lord would soon have more. Hayard and Godwin were shaping up well, and would soon be valued members of the guard. Instead of heading to the kitchens, Osrith made her way slowly out through the palace gardens. It was the hot summer air making it difficult for her to breathe. Osrith told herself, not her encounter with Ethelwold, and she began to walk, her walk taking her beyond the palace gates and out into Winchester's Market Square. At the centre was the large stone cross with kneeling places around it. The ground fell back as one of the roads headed south, towards Hampton, and behind her the great cathedral which sat adjacent the palace, in which the wedding had just taken place. There were few people around. Many had been outside the cathedral, a huge crowd to display their happiness and joy for the newly married couple, and Alfred had made a speech about a union between Mercia and Wessex, quite omitting he had been forcing Mercia's hand for many a year, displacing Ceolf's rule as the Lord of Mercia by overwriting ancient laws of that land with duplicates of those in Wessex. If there was going to be an alliance, it needed to be equitable between those lands. This did not please many in Mercia, but they had more pressing concerns, namely the Northmen on the border of the Humber and across east, through the Pennines and to the Wirral. They incurred, and Alfred sent men. There was rumour that even the Mercian record, that centuries-old book containing the history of the kingdom, had come south and was in Alfred's library. It had not been seen in 10 years. The Northmen were a blessing to Alfred's expansionist plans into the rich lands of Mercia, as well as a curse. Yet, by the look on Ethelred's face that day, Ethelwold was not the only one who coveted the crown of Wessex, and while Alfred might have thought he had gained Mercia by stealth, some, including the Lord of Mercia, may think entirely the other way round. Thinking about the all-but invasion by alliance of Wessex into Mercia filled Osrith's mind as she made a circumnavigation through the streets of Winchester, with the aim of ending back up at the cross and back into the palace for the remainder of her day's duty. It was easier to dwell on someone else's. Had the Hainauled felt like that? When Rinulf had married Osrith's ancestor, King Oswy, had felt that Bernicia had invaded them, or that they had expanded back to the eastern sea and regained the territory lost to his great-grandfather. Had the Cymric planned a second battle of Kettrath to overcome the Say and drive them back into the sea? Were they wise enough not to trust the Picts this time? Beside the kneeling cross, Osrith sat, on a low wall that separated the palace from the commercial buildings, watching the few people who were there, some heading between the narrow streets to the alehouses, a few older men and women buying all manner of food, for the harvest was in. Beside the western entrance of the palace Osrith noticed a group of warriors sitting together. One of them seemed to be lounging, another standing beside him. As she watched, it was like a different world unfolding to her, like the days she had spent on the Bibbenberg moorland above her fortress home. Nothing much seemed to be happening between the blades of grass, but the more still you were, the more the tiny kingdom of insect opened up and she would be looking at a life land all of its own. Osrith soon detected her brother. He was the lounging warrior. Before him was a woman with her son, and in the midday brilliance Osrith could make out that it was Elfberg, the two cranes' employee, deep in conversation with the warrior her brother called Citric. And now a man was approaching, one who seemed to be a monk, dressed in a rough woolen robe tied with a rope, his pale hair around his head. He seemed to be in deep conversation with Utad, who was now standing up, and seemed to be insisting the monk leave them. But the man was insistent, gesticulating to Utad, and then to himself, and then to the palace. Utad kept trying to still him by waving his arm towards him, but at last the monk got his way and was allowed to approach them, and they continued the conversation in the space between them. That was them all, Osrith thought, as she looked across to her brother again. All of his men were there, and Stipa had come behind them and was addressing Utad. She made to get up too. She had probably been away long enough from the hall. But she had not counted correctly. For, when she got to her feet, Osrith felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned quickly, but not quick enough to raise Buey, and her brother's Irishman put a finger to his lips, shushing her. "I know you followed us that time Citric was after you," the Irishman was saying, as Osrith glowered, hand halfway to Buey. "Why? You sang a new Ineal song." "So did I. So I'll ask you again, why?" Osrith relaxed a little, and instead of withdrawing her blade, folded her arms in front of her. "I heard a tongue I recognized," she said, hoping it sounded genuine. Finan's face flickered with recognition, but did not move away. "You are a long way from home," Osrith replied, her hand this time reaching down for tagged Seeks. "As are you, Gaelish woman," Finan offered. "Been noun Gaelish?" Osrith nodded her head slowly, but did not correct him. "And you?" Osrith asked, looking into his pale blue eyes. She had seen eyes like those before. "Are you a Varian?" "I was," Finan replied, not moving out of her immediate vicinity. "And you?" "I am Lackland, once in service to a king, in Alba." Finan's eyes narrowed, thoughtfully. "Who died, and whose throne was taken by Aidan Griogair?" How strange it all sounded, like a story from another life, like a veil pulled down between Wessex and Alba, which she had sailed through with Ulf and Gert. "My lord died, so I turned mercenary." It was as true as Osrith was ever likely to admit. "So you followed us because of my beautiful voice?" Finan postured, disbelievingly. "I did." She glanced over to Utad. Finan followed the path of her gaze, before she pulled it away and back to him. "You have a soft position here," Finan proposed, smiling a broad smile. "Guarding the Etheling." "I have known worse, it is true," Osrith agreed. "And you fought the prince well yesterday." Osrith felt her heart glow, but she fought to maintain dignity. "Te parlit, mothai hirna." At her words of thanks, addressing him as a lord, Finan threw back his head and laughed. "Chanal me thai hirna. Thay, thai hirna." He pointed to Utad. Then, he inclined his head towards Osrith's ear. "I saw Ethelwold speaking to you earlier." "Yes." Osrith replied, curtly. She had felt unnerved by Ethelwold, but here, in the bright light of a high summer's day, with people going about their business, her fear seemed much diluted. "Thamidillich." Finan was sorry, he said. "Well, you cannot help his behavior, can you?" Osrith looked into his eyes. Osrith had never met him, of that she was sure. Yet, Finan's face looked familiar. "I could murder him, the little turd," he replied, but broke off, and nodded to his lord as Utad approached them, with the warrior, Citric, who had chased her over the matter of her speaking to Elfberg. Citric looked abashed, and when he turned to try to protest something to Utad, her brother shook his shoulder and gestured in Osrith's direction. "He has something to say to you," Utad announced, as Citric looked remorsefully at Osrith. Osrith looked back at him, waiting. It took 2 deep sighs, and a glare from Utad for their warrior to speak. "I am sorry for our disagreement," he said, baldly. Osrith felt a smile flicker at her mouth, at the absurdity of the situation. Clearly, he must now know that she was a woman, and unlikely to be a rival. Uhtred shook his shoulder, and Sihrik shuffled his feet. But, Osrith replied before the young man could expand. I think Elfber saw something there is not between us. Sihrik nodded his dark head, glaring at her, but said nothing. She is a very beautiful woman. Yes, he agreed, then picked up his head, defiantly. And I intend to be married to her, he shot back. Osrith bowed her head in acknowledgement. Clearly it had taken a bit of courage to approach her over matter of the heart, courage, and the will of his lord. Osrith could have teased him about it, but frankly, she was relieved. Elfber would hopefully have a home now, and wouldn't have to whore, and Osrith would be able to go to the Two Cranes for a drink unmolested. So, that is an end to it. Uhtred looked to Osrith, who nodded, and she watched her brother turn, hand still on Sihrik's arm as the young warrior looked back over his shoulder, giving Osrith a frown. So, that's sorted out, then. Osrith looked up to Finan, who grinned, and began to follow them. Then, he turned to Shiare and Drasta. Shiare, Osrith called back, glancing back to the palace. They were going inside, and she watched them step through the gates. Making to go too, she looked in their direction again and caught Finan looking across at her once more.